Whenever I think about a big challenge, I also find it helpful to draw some inspiration from some other successes of the past. And I think one of the successes that should speak to all of us in this country and around the world this month and this year, it is a success in some messages that also came from the decade that gave birth to CES. Because the 1960s were not only a decade of advances in great consumer technology, even more, they were advances that started with a very different goal in mind, a huge goal. A goal that an American president set for the United States in 1962. It was President John F. Kennedy. At a time when few thought it possible, he put a stake in the ground and said that the United States would go to the moon before the decade came to an end. And he did what we always need to do whenever we pursue a big goal. We first have to imagine that we can achieve it. He did it in a famous speech in September of 1962 at Rice University in Texas. He had some famous words that are worth drawing inspiration from even today.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
It's remarkable in hindsight to look back at that speech and just appreciate the sheer scale of ambition that was set by the president and pursued by a nation in a way that served the world. But I think that the lessons that come out of that speech and that journey are greater than just the importance of that ambition. There are two other things that in some ways are even more important as we meet virtually in 2021. The first is this. When humanity finally first orbited the moon in December of 1968, it was a terrible time. It had been a difficult year. It had been a year in the United States that had witnessed not just violence in the street, but the assassination of two of the country's great leaders, Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy. It was a time when the days on planet Earth were dominated by all of the divisions between us. But what did people learn when they got to the moon? What was really important was not the rocks that they would ultimately pick up when a lunar lander landed a year later. It was the ability to look back at Earth itself, to see the planet that the astronauts had come from. And more than anything, to realize this, that despite all of the differences that people discussed every day, there was also a common bond for everyone on planet Earth. That, I think, is a powerful lesson for all of us as we create technology to serve the world in January of 2021. But there was one other aspect that I think in some ways was more prescient still. Because if you go back to John F. Kennedy's speech at Rice University in 1962, there is one slice of it that he could have been providing not just to the people of his time, but to the people of ours. And not just to the world, but to all of us in our industry in particular.
We set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won. And they must be won and used for the progress of all people. For space science, like nuclear science and all technology, has no conscience of its own. Whether it will become a force for good or ill depends on man.
Almost 5 decades later, there are those 4 words that echo down the ages. Technology has no conscience. It was true then, it is true today, it has been true in every era of technology. Technology has no conscience, but people do, and we do. And as an industry, we must exercise our conscience. For all of us as individuals, in companies and as an industry, every day when we go to work, we will decide whether technology is used for good or for ill. That is our opportunity, that is our challenge, but more than that, that is our responsibility to ensure that the technology that we create serves the world.
So, we heard the big picture about how technology and leadership impact space exploration. But as a side note, it is interesting to mention that Microsoft is already engaged in space operations, with the satellite industry in particular. As satellite operators send more satellites to space, they need more ground stations to communicate to their satellites. Building your own ground stations is often very expensive, and it requires capital expenditures. Other options for satellite operators are to rent or lease a ground station, which often locks them down in long-term contracts, which again makes it very expensive for them. In addition, as more data comes down from space, more computing and more resources are required to process and store these data. For these reasons, Microsoft introduced Azure Orbital. This is a fully managed cloud-based, ground station as a service, that enables operators to communicate to their satellites, downlink or uplink data, and process it, and thereby scale operations. With Azure Orbital, Microsoft deploys satellite ground stations in its data centers, enabling a variety of scenarios for customers, ranging from Earth observation to global satellite communications, and in a variety of industry segments, such as remote sensing, defense, intelligence, oil and gas, and several other industry segments. We will have more videos about computing needs for space explorers, so we hope you will subscribe to this channel to get the updates.